The bustling atmosphere of St. James Hospital filled the air as doctors and nurses moved swiftly through the hallways. It was a typical Tuesday morning, with the usual rhythm of patients being admitted, procedures being scheduled, and medical staff hurrying between tasks. The beeping of machines and the murmur of hushed conversations created a backdrop of organized chaos, a familiar soundtrack for the staff who worked there every day. Angela had been a nurse at St. James for almost 8 years. Her dedication to her job was evident in the way she approached her work, always with a sense of compassion and professionalism. She wasn't just efficient, she was kind. The patients appreciated that about her. She had a way of making them feel seen and cared for, even on the most stressful days. She often said that if she could ease a patient's fears or make their day a little better, then she was doing her job right. Today was no different. Angela was on her way to check on Mr. Wilson, an elderly patient in room 305 who had been admitted for chronic respiratory issues. Mr. Wilson had been a frequent visitor to the hospital over the past few years, and Angela had gotten to know him quite well. He was a quiet man, always polite and observant, with a kind smile that hid the toll of his health struggles. As Angela entered the room, she greeted Mr. Wilson warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. How are we feeling today?" Mr. Wilson returned her smile. "Morning, Angela. I'm doing all right, considering," he replied with a faint chuckle. "Just another day of keeping these old lungs of mine working." Angela checked his vitals and adjusted the position of his oxygen mask. "You're doing great," she assured him. "Just keep taking it easy. The doctor will be in shortly to go over your progress." Moments later, the door swung open and Dr. Lawrence walked in. He was a seasoned physician, known for his skill and efficiency but also for his impatience and occasionally condescending attitude. His tall, imposing figure and stern expression often intimidated both patients and staff. Angela braced herself. She had worked with Dr. Lawrence enough times to know that he wasn't one to mince words. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," Dr. Lawrence said curtly as he picked up the chart from the end of the bed. Without looking at Angela, he added, "And, nurse, have you updated the patient's records yet? I don't see the latest lab results here." Angela stepped forward, maintaining her calm demeanor. "I submitted the lab work this morning, doctor. The results should be in the system shortly." Dr. Lawrence frowned as he scanned the chart. "Well, it's not in the file. I shouldn't have to remind you to keep these things updated," he said, his tone edged with irritation. "I expect my staff to be thorough." Angela felt the sting of his words but remained composed. She knew she had done her job correctly, but arguing with Dr. Lawrence in front of a patient wasn't the right move. Instead, she simply replied, "I'll check on it right away, doctor." Mr. Wilson watched the exchange silently. He didn't say a word, but his eyes followed the interaction closely, and a slight frown crossed his face. As Dr. Lawrence continued to speak to him about his condition, there was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, an unspoken tension that Angela could sense even as she finished her tasks and quietly excused herself. Outside the room, she took a deep breath. Being treated dismissively by Dr. Lawrence wasn't new to her, but it still stung. She had learned to pick her battles, knowing that challenging him directly rarely led to anything constructive. Yet, she couldn't help but feel the frustration building up. She took another moment to collect herself before heading to the nurse's station to check on the lab results as promised. Angela knew she would need to keep pushing through the day, just as she always did. St. James was her place of work and her place of purpose, and she would continue to serve the patients with the compassion they deserved, no matter how undervalued she might feel by some of her colleagues. The morning continued with its usual demands. As Angela moved from one patient to the next, she couldn't shake the feeling of Mr. Wilson's eyes on her during that exchange. It was as if he had sensed more than just an oversight with lab results. He had witnessed the dynamic that often went unspoken, the subtle hierarchy that existed even in a place where care and compassion were supposed to be the guiding principles. Dr. Lawrence, meanwhile, was already moving on to his next patient, seemingly unaffected by the exchange that had just occurred. For him, it was just another routine interaction, another reminder that things needed to be done his way. Angela wondered if he even noticed the impact his words had on others, or if he had grown so used to his own authority that he had forgotten what it meant to respect those around him. Back at the nurse's station, Angela pulled up Mr. Wilson's latest lab results on the computer. They had indeed come in, just as she had said. She made the necessary updates to his chart and notified Dr. Lawrence's office. But the thought lingered. How many times would she have to prove herself before she was truly seen for the professional she was? Angela pushed through the rest of her morning duties, doing her best to shake off the lingering frustration from her encounter with Dr. Lawrence. As much as she tried not to let it bother her, there was a quiet sense of indignation building inside. She had worked hard to earn her place as a nurse and had always been committed to her patients. Yet, it seemed like moments like the one that morning kept reminding her how easily her efforts could be dismissed. Around mid-morning, Angela returned to Mr. Wilson's room to check on him. She found him sitting up in bed, his eyes bright with curiosity as she entered. "Back again so soon?" he teased gently. "I must be getting the VIP treatment today." Angela smiled as she adjusted the settings on his phone. "You know it, Mr. Wilson. We've got to make sure you're in top shape." Just as she was about to take his blood pressure, Dr. Lawrence entered the room abruptly, interrupting their light-hearted exchange. He walked in with his usual briskness, barely acknowledging Angela as he approached the bed. Without even a glance in her direction, he began discussing Mr. Wilson's test results, his voice carrying the tone of authority that seemed almost automatic. "The latest tests show that your lung function has stabilized, but we'll need to keep monitoring you closely. You'll likely be here for a few more days," Dr. Lawrence explained to Mr. Wilson, his focus still entirely on the chart in his hands. Angela took a step back, giving the doctor space as he continued. She knew better than to interrupt him, especially when he was in one of his focused moods. However, as Dr. Lawrence flipped through the pages of the chart, his expression changed. "Why is this medication not on the list?" he asked sharply, turning his gaze toward Angela. "I ordered it yesterday." Angela hesitated for a moment before answering. "The medication was ordered, doctor. The pharmacy was delayed in processing it, but I followed up this morning. It should be delivered to the floor shortly." Dr. Lawrence's face hardened with irritation. "That's not acceptable, nurse. When I give an order, I expect it to be carried out without delay. This isn't the first time I've had to remind you about attention to detail." His tone was dismissive, and the weight of the reprimand hung heavily in the air. Angela felt her cheeks flush, not with guilt but with the sting of being scolded in front of a patient. She had done everything within her power to ensure Mr. Wilson received his medication promptly, and it wasn't fair to be held accountable for delays that were beyond her control. "I understand, doctor," she replied evenly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll make sure it's taken care of right away." Dr. Lawrence shook his head, clearly not satisfied with her response. "See that you do," he said curtly before turning back to Mr. Wilson as if the exchange hadn't happened. "Now, Mr. Wilson, as I was saying, we need to keep monitoring your fluid intake closely. Make sure to let the nurse know if you feel any discomfort." Mr. Wilson's eyes flicked between Dr. Lawrence and Angela, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. He had seen how Angela's demeanor changed when Dr. Lawrence had addressed her so harshly, and it didn't sit right with him. Angela had always been nothing but attentive and kind, and Mr. Wilson couldn't understand why she deserved to be spoken to that way. Angela quietly resumed her tasks, checking Mr. Wilson's vitals and making a note in his chart. She didn't look at Dr. Lawrence as he left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. She took a deep breath, reminding herself once more that it was just another day, another difficult encounter, and that she had to keep her focus on the patients who needed her. As she finished her work and turned to leave, Mr. Wilson spoke up. "Angela, wait a moment." She paused at the door and turned back to him. "Yes, Mr. Wilson?" "I saw the way he spoke to you," Mr. Wilson said, his voice low but steady. "It wasn't right. You didn't deserve that." Angela forced a smile, though there was a hint of sadness behind it. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I appreciate that. But sometimes, You just have to let things go and keep doing your job. Mr. Wilson shook his head. You shouldn't have to just accept it, he replied softly. You're a good nurse, and anyone who's been in your care can see that. Angela's smile became a little more genuine, but she still felt the weight of the morning's events pressing down on her. Thank you for saying that, she said quietly. It means a lot. She left the room, not realizing that Mr. Wilson was already forming an idea in his mind, one that would soon lead to a chain of events neither she nor Dr. Lawrence could have anticipated. For Mr. Wilson, watching the way Angela had been spoken to had stirred something inside him, a sense of injustice that he felt compelled to address. As the day went on, Angela tried to shake off the frustration and move forward with her tasks. But despite her best efforts, the incident with Dr. Lawrence kept replaying in her mind. There was a part of her that wondered if she could ever change the perception that some people had of her, or if she would always be seen as someone who was less competent simply because of who she was. It wasn't just the humiliation that stung, it was the fear that her hard work and dedication would always be overshadowed by moments like these. Yet, as she thought back to Mr. Wilson's words, there was a small spark of comfort. He had seen her for who she really was, and that made a difference. Meanwhile, in his room, Mr. Wilson was already starting to write a letter. He wasn't entirely sure what he would say just yet, but he knew he wanted to put into words what he had observed and how deeply it had affected him. It wasn't just about defending Angela, it was about standing up for what was right. The rest of the day unfolded with the usual flow of patients and procedures, but Angela couldn't entirely shake off the incident from the morning. As she moved from one task to another, she made a conscious effort to maintain her focus and professionalism, masking any signs of frustration. Her colleagues noticed nothing out of the ordinary. If Angela was feeling the weight of Dr. Lawrence's harsh words, she wasn't letting it show. At the nurse's station, she updated charts and prepared medication schedules. Her fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as she entered the latest data, her mind drifting back to Mr. Wilson's words earlier. They had been unexpected, but comforting, an acknowledgement that she wasn't alone in recognizing the injustice of the situation. Angela wasn't one to dwell on negativity. She had learned early in her career that resilience was key to surviving in a high-pressure environment like St. James. The long hours, emotional toll, and moments of doubt were all part of the job. Yet, today felt different. The way Dr. Lawrence had spoken to her, the condescending tone and public scolding, had cut deeper than usual. She paused for a moment, her gaze drifting out the large window that overlooked the hospital courtyard. She had always found solace in the little pockets of calm she could find in the day, whether it was a brief moment of silence or the sight of the sunlight streaming through the trees outside. It reminded her of why she had chosen this profession in the first place, to bring light and comfort to others, even on the darkest days. Returning to her work, she noticed one of the newer nurses, Emily, struggling to change an IV bag for a patient down the hall. Without a second thought, Angela walked over to help. She guided Emily through the process, explaining each step calmly and ensuring the patient was comfortable. "Thanks, Angela," Emily said gratefully. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Angela offered a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it. You're doing great. It just takes a bit of practice, that's all." As she returned to the nurse's station, Angela couldn't help but think about how different things would be if she had someone like Dr. Lawrence guiding her when she was starting out. She had always had to figure things out on her own, navigating the challenges of the job without the mentorship or support she often provided to others. The reality was that her journey as a nurse had been filled with moments where she had to prove herself over and over again, often under the scrutiny of people like Dr. Lawrence who never seemed to notice the extra effort she put in. But there were also moments that made it all worthwhile. The gratitude in a patient's eyes, the relief on a family member's face, and even the quiet appreciation from colleagues like Emily reminded her why she continued to push forward. For Angela, nursing was not just a job, it was a calling. She found fulfillment in being a source of comfort and strength to those who needed it most, and she wasn't about to let a moment of discouragement take that away from her. That evening, as her shift came to an end, Angela stopped by Mr. Wilson's room one last time. He was sitting in his chair by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "Just wanted to check in before I head out," she said as she entered. "How are you feeling?" Mr. Wilson turned to face her, his expression softening into a warm smile. "I'm doing fine, Angela. Just thinking about life, I suppose." She nodded, sensing that there was more behind his words. "Anything on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "You know, I've been around long enough to see how people treat each other, sometimes well, sometimes not. I just want you to know that people notice the good you do. Even if it doesn't always feel that way." Angela felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know exactly what to say, but the sincerity in Mr. Wilson's voice touched her. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. That means more to me than you know." She was about to leave when Mr. Wilson added, "And Angela, don't ever doubt that you're making a difference." Those words lingered with her as she walked down the hall, a quiet sense of validation filling the space where frustration had been. It wasn't just about the work itself, it was about the connections she formed with her patients, the small moments that spoke louder than any reprimand ever could. Angela left the hospital that night feeling a mix of exhaustion and resilience. She had endured another difficult day, but she had also been reminded of her purpose. She knew that in a place like St. James, where patients came and went and doctors moved at the speed of light, the value of a nurse's care could easily go unnoticed. But people like Mr. Wilson saw it. They felt it. And that was enough to keep her going. Unbeknownst to Angela, the letter Mr. Wilson had begun writing was nearly finished. His hand trembled slightly as he penned the final lines, but his heart was steady. This was not just a letter, it was a testament. A recognition of Angela's quiet strength and the impact she had, even when others failed to see it. It was time for someone to speak up for her, and he was determined to make sure his voice was heard. As the night wore on, Mr. Wilson found himself unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to the exchange he had witnessed that morning between Dr. Lawrence and Angela. The more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Dr. Lawrence had spoken to her, as though her hard work and dedication meant nothing. Sitting up in his bed, he reached for the stack of papers on the bedside table. He had started writing the letter earlier in the day but hadn't yet decided what exactly he wanted to say. Now, the words seemed to flow more easily. It was as though the memory of Angela's quiet strength had unlocked something within him, a determination to do what was right. The letter began with a simple acknowledgement. "To whom it may concern, I am writing this letter to share my thoughts on someone who, in my opinion, represents the very best of what this hospital has to offer. Her name is Angela, and she is the kind of nurse who goes beyond just fulfilling her duties. She brings comfort, compassion, and dignity to her patients, even under challenging circumstances." As he continued writing, Mr. Wilson's thoughts drifted back to a time when he had been at St. James not as a patient, but as a family member. His late wife, Margaret, had spent her final days in this very hospital. It was a difficult time, filled with uncertainty and sorrow, and yet, there had been moments of grace. Angela had been there back then, too, providing care and solace during those agonizing final weeks. Mr. Wilson vividly remembered Angela's presence during the last night of Margaret's life. It had been Angela who had stayed by Margaret's side, speaking to her softly even as she slipped in and out of consciousness. When Margaret passed, Angela had taken Mr. Wilson aside, offering her condolences with a sincerity that had been a rare comfort in the midst of his grief. "I do not know if Angela remembers those days," Mr. Wilson wrote in the letter, "but I do. Her compassion was not a grand gesture, it was quiet and unassuming, the kind of kindness that seeks no recognition. That is precisely why it is so deserving of recognition now." He paused for a moment, unsure of how to address the incident with Dr. Lawrence. He didn't want the letter to be about condemning the doctor, but rather about highlighting the disparity between the way Angela was treated and the value she truly brought to her work. With a deep breath, he continued. "I had the opportunity to observe Angela at work recently, and I was disheartened by the lack of respect she was shown by a fellow staff member. It pains me to see someone who gives so much to her patients being spoken to as though her efforts mean little. If my voice carries any weight, let it be used to emphasize the importance of recognizing the extraordinary people in this hospital who bring not only skill but also heart to their work." Mr. Wilson signed his name at the bottom of the letter, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He knew that writing this letter wouldn't change the world, but it was a small step toward making sure that people like Angela were seen and valued. Folding the letter neatly, he placed it in an envelope and left it on the bedside table, where a nurse would find it the next morning. The following day, Angela arrived at the hospital early. She liked to get a head start before her shift officially began, using the quiet moments before the rush to prepare for the day ahead. As she was organizing her things at the nurse's station, one of her colleagues approached with an envelope in hand. "This came in for you, Angela," her coworker said, handing her the letter. "Looks like it was left at Mr. Wilson's bedside." Curious, Angela took the envelope and opened it carefully. As she unfolded the letter and began reading, her eyes widened in surprise. She had not expected anything like this. Line by line, she felt a mix of emotions rising within her: gratitude, humility, and a deep sense of validation. The letter was not just a compliment, it was a testament to her years of dedication, a recognition of all the small things she did that often went unnoticed. The part about Margaret took her by surprise. She hadn't realized that Mr. Wilson was Margaret's husband, nor did she know the full impact her care had made during that time. To her, it had been another moment of doing what was needed, of being there for someone in their final days. But to Mr. Wilson, it had been so much more. Finishing the letter, Angela folded it back up and took a deep breath. It was a rare thing to receive such heartfelt acknowledgement, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not the kind of pride that came from arrogance, but the quiet pride of knowing that, even in a job that could be thankless, she had made a real difference. Just as she was about to tuck the letter away in her bag, her supervisor called her into the office. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if this had anything to do with Mr. Wilson's letter. When she stepped into the supervisor's office, her supervisor's expression was unusually warm. "Angela, I just wanted to speak with you for a moment," the supervisor began. "We received a very special letter from a patient, Mr. Wilson. I understand he left a copy for you as well. I just want to say that it's not often we see this kind of recognition for our staff, and you should be very proud." Angela felt her cheeks flush slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It means a lot to hear that." Her supervisor continued, "I've shared the letter with the administration. It's important that we all recognize the value of the work being done here. I'm sure this will encourage others to take note of the contributions that often go unnoticed." As Angela left the office, a new sense of resolve filled her. It wasn't about seeking praise or recognition, but about knowing that her work did matter. People like Mr. Wilson saw it. And maybe, just maybe, others would start to see it too. The news of Mr. Wilson's letter quickly spread through the hospital. It wasn't common for patients to go out of their way to express such heartfelt appreciation, and when they did, it was even rarer for a letter to reach the administration's attention. The recognition for Angela was not just appreciated, it was a breath of fresh air in a place where the pace often left little time for reflection. Angela tried to keep her emotions in check, but there was a new energy in her step as she went about her duties. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen. It wasn't that she hadn't received compliments from patients before, she often did. But having someone like Mr. Wilson put his thoughts into words and take the time to ensure that others would hear them, it was a kind of acknowledgement she hadn't dared to hope for. At the same time, there was a different buzz around the hospital's administrative offices. The letter had reached the chief nursing officer, who had been deeply moved by Mr. Wilson's eloquent praise for Angela's work. It wasn't just a matter of one nurse receiving recognition, it was a reflection on the entire nursing staff's contributions, which often went unspoken in the day-to-day rush of medical care. The letter was soon pinned to a bulletin board in the staff lounge, with a handwritten note from the chief nursing officer, "Let's remember the difference we make every day." As Angela walked past the lounge and saw the letter pinned up for all to see, she paused for a moment. She felt a swell of mixed emotions: gratitude, humility, and even a touch of nervousness. Being singled out was not something she sought, and there was a part of her that wondered if Dr. Lawrence would hear about this. She hadn't seen him since the incident with Mr. Wilson, but she knew that a letter like this was bound to reach his ears eventually. Meanwhile, in his office, Dr. Lawrence was indeed reading the letter. It had been handed to him by the chief of medicine, who suggested that he take a moment to reflect on its contents. The praise for Angela was sincere and well-deserved, but there was also an unmistakable undertone addressing the disparity in how she had been treated. It was not a direct accusation, but the implication was clear enough. The words, "lack of respect she was shown by a fellow staff member," echoed in his mind, and he knew exactly what Mr. Wilson had been referring to. Dr. Lawrence set the letter down on his desk and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he felt a flash of irritation that a patient had gone out of his way to highlight an issue that, in his view, didn't warrant this kind of attention. After all, hospitals were fast-paced environments, and tensions ran high. It was not uncommon for staff to speak bluntly when tasks weren't completed as expected. But then another thought occurred to him, a thought that slowly shifted his perspective. It wasn't just that Mr. Wilson had noticed the incident, it was that he had felt compelled to say something about it. The letter wasn't just about Angela, it was a statement about the kind of workplace culture that had taken root at St. James, one where small indignities could accumulate over time and erode the spirit of even the most dedicated staff. Dr. Lawrence couldn't ignore the underlying message. There needed to be change, and it had to start with people like him. The following day, Dr. Lawrence spotted Angela in the hallway near the nurses' station. She was speaking with another nurse, explaining a procedure and offering guidance with the same calm and kindness she always did. He hesitated for a moment, then approached her. "Nurse Angela," he began, his tone uncharacteristically measured. "May I have a word?" Angela looked up, her expression neutral. "Of course, doctor," she replied. Dr. Lawrence led her to a quieter corner of the hallway. He took a breath, and for the first time in a long while, he chose his words carefully. "I read the letter from Mr. Wilson," he said. "And I wanted to acknowledge that. I could have handled things differently the other day." Angela listened, her face revealing little. She hadn't expected this conversation, at least not so soon. "I appreciate you saying that," she responded calmly. "But I hope you understand that it wasn't just about that one incident." Dr. Lawrence nodded, a hint of discomfort flickering in his eyes. "I do," he admitted. "And I know that I've been demanding, perhaps more than necessary at times. I want to work on that. I recognize that the way I communicate affects the team, and I don't want my actions to diminish the work that you and the other nurses do here." There was a moment of silence as Angela absorbed his words. She could sense that this wasn't easy for him, and she respected that he had chosen to address the issue, even if it had taken a patient's letter to prompt him. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice steady but kind. "I'm here to support our patients, just like you are. I think we all benefit when we support each other." Dr. Lawrence inclined his head slightly, as though conceding her point. "Yes, we do," he agreed. "And thank you for your continued dedication, even when it hasn't been fully appreciated." As Dr. Lawrence walked away, Angela felt a quiet sense of closure. It wasn't as though one conversation could change the dynamics of an entire hospital overnight, but it was a start. The recognition she had received because of Mr. Wilson's letter had not only lifted her spirits but had also sparked a conversation that needed to happen. Later that afternoon, Angela visited Mr. Wilson's room to check on him. He was resting, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "I heard they put the letter up on the bulletin board," he said, a small smile playing at his lips. Angela laughed softly. "They did," she confirmed. "You've made quite the impact around here." "Well," Mr. Wilson replied, his voice tinged with warmth, "I didn't write it just to stir things up. I wrote it because you deserve to be seen for who you are." "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Angela said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "You've done more for me than you realize." He gave a slight nod. "And maybe, just maybe, it'll open some eyes around here. It's about time, don't you think?" As Angela left his room, she couldn't help but feel that a small but significant shift had occurred at St. James. The letter had been more than just words on a page. It had been a call to acknowledge the quiet heroes of the hospital, those who worked tirelessly, often without recognition, to make a difference in the lives of others. The days following the conversation between Angela and Dr. Lawrence brought a subtle yet noticeable change to the atmosphere at St. James Hospital. Word of Mr. Wilson's letter continued to circulate, and the effect was evident. Nurses who had once felt undervalued were starting to speak up more, not out of defiance but with a renewed sense of purpose. There was a quiet hope that perhaps things could be different, that recognition and respect could become more than just occasional rewards, but a consistent part of the work culture. For Angela, the change was palpable. Though she remained humble, there was a confidence in her step that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about receiving praise, it was about being reminded of why she had chosen this path. Mr. Wilson's letter had given her the push to embrace her role fully, not just as a caregiver but as an advocate for the respect and dignity of all nurses. Dr. Lawrence, on the other hand, found himself confronting an unfamiliar and uncomfortable feeling. He had always prided himself on his competence and authority, qualities that had served him well in a demanding field. But now, the realization that his approach might have done more harm than good was weighing on him. The letter had opened his eyes to the fact that his brusque demeanor wasn't merely a professional quirk, it was affecting the very fabric of his team's morale. One morning, about a week after the letter had been shared with the hospital administration, Dr. Lawrence was making his rounds when he saw Angela assisting a patient in the hallway. The patient, a middle-aged woman who was recovering from surgery, leaned on Angela for support as they walked slowly toward the physical therapy room. Dr. Lawrence observed the way Angela spoke to the woman, gentle but encouraging, every word aimed at making the patient feel stronger and more capable. As he watched Angela, something inside him shifted. He approached the nurse's station and asked one of the attendants to find a time slot in his schedule for a staff meeting with the nursing team. It was time to address the elephant in the room. The meeting was scheduled for the following day. It was unusual for Dr. Lawrence to call such meetings, and as word spread, there was a mix of curiosity and anxiety among the nursing staff. Angela, too, felt a flutter of uncertainty as she took her seat in the small conference room where the meeting would be held. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that whatever happened, she had to remain composed. The room was filled with nurses, some sitting and others standing along the back wall. Dr. Lawrence stood at the front, his usual confident posture slightly less rigid than normal. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you all for taking the time to be here today," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years commanding a room. "I wanted to have this meeting because, recently, I've been reflecting on some feedback that was brought to my attention." He paused, glancing at Angela, whose expression remained steady. "A letter written by a patient brought to light some things about the way we function as a team," he continued. Specifically, the letter highlighted the way certain interactions can undermine the hard work and dedication that our nurses bring to this hospital. "I'm not proud to admit this, but I realize that I have not always treated you with the respect you deserve." A murmur swept through the room, the air thick with a mixture of surprise and relief. For many of the nurses present, hearing Dr. Lawrence acknowledge his behavior so openly was not something they had ever expected. Dr. Lawrence continued, his tone softer than usual. "I know that words alone cannot undo past actions. I've been demanding, and at times, dismissive. I've held all of you to high standards because I believe that was what was best for our patients. But I see now that there is a difference between holding someone to high standards and making them feel undervalued." Angela listened intently, her gaze fixed on the doctor. She could see that this was not easy for him, and there was a sincerity in his voice that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just saying this for the sake of formality, he was making a genuine effort to change. "I'm committed to doing better," Dr. Lawrence said, looking around the room. "We are all here for the same purpose, to provide the best care possible for our patients. But we can't do that if we don't support one another. From now on, I want us to focus not just on our individual roles but on how we can lift each other up as a team." There was a brief silence before one of the nurses in the back spoke up. "Doctor, it means a lot to hear you say that," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's not easy working in such a fast-paced environment, and sometimes it feels like no matter how much we give, it's never enough. But hearing you acknowledge this, it makes a difference." Angela found herself nodding in agreement, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and hope. She knew that this meeting wouldn't solve everything, but it was a step in the right direction. For Dr. Lawrence to stand in front of the team and admit that he had been wrong was a powerful moment, one that she hoped would mark the beginning of a more positive culture at St. James. After the meeting, Dr. Lawrence approached Angela privately. "I wanted to speak with you again, Angela," he said, his tone far gentler than it had been during their previous conversations. "I don't know if it's enough to say that I'm sorry, but I am." Angela met his gaze, seeing a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "Apologies are a good start, Doctor," she replied. "What matters now is the follow-through." Dr. Lawrence gave a slight nod. "You're right," he agreed. "And I promise you, I intend to follow through. If there's anything I can do to better support you and the other nurses, I'm open to hearing it." Angela appreciated the sentiment, though she understood that real change would take time. "I think we're all just looking for a little more respect," she said simply. "We work hard to keep this place running smoothly, and it would mean a lot to feel like that's recognized." "You have my word," Dr. Lawrence said. "I'll do better." As Angela walked away from the conversation, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. The acknowledgement from Dr. Lawrence, combined with his public address to the staff, had brought an unexpected sense of healing. She wasn't naive enough to believe that everything would change overnight, but the shift was already happening. It was in the way the nurses interacted with one another, in the glances of approval and encouragement shared across the room, and even in the softened approach of a once stern doctor. Angela knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were all moving in the same direction. In the days following the staff meeting, the atmosphere at St. James Hospital continued to evolve. It was subtle at first, but gradually, there was a noticeable shift in the way the medical team interacted. Conversations that had once been rushed and impersonal now included a bit more warmth, a touch of empathy that had long been missing. Nurses exchanged more than just quick updates at the nurses' station. They began to share encouraging words and express gratitude for each other's help. Angela noticed the change, not just in her colleagues but in herself. There was a newfound sense of ease in her daily routine, a feeling that she wasn't simply pushing against the tide. She felt lighter, as though the weight of unspoken expectations had been lifted, if only a little. The recognition she had received because of Mr. Wilson's letter had validated not just her work but the work of all the nurses who often went unacknowledged. She saw the change in Dr. Lawrence as well. Though he still carried the same briskness in his step and maintained his high standards, there was a softness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. He was making a conscious effort to connect with the nursing staff, taking time to listen when they had concerns and offering more constructive feedback instead of curt reprimands. One afternoon, as Angela was preparing to administer medication to a patient, Dr. Lawrence approached her in the hallway. "Angela," he called, his tone friendlier than she was used to, "do you have a moment?" "Of course, doctor," she replied, pausing her work to give him her attention. "I just wanted to thank you for your suggestion the other day about the new pain management protocol," he said. "I reviewed your notes, and I think you made some very good points. We're going to implement some of your recommendations." Angela blinked in surprise. "Thank you, doctor," she said. "I'm glad you found them helpful." "I did," Dr. Lawrence continued, "and I'd like to encourage you to keep sharing your ideas. You have a good understanding of what the patients need, and that perspective is invaluable." Angela felt a small surge of pride. It wasn't just about the acknowledgement, it was about being treated as an equal, someone whose insights were respected and valued. "I will, doctor." "Thank you," she said, and for the first time, the exchange felt natural, like a genuine dialogue between colleagues rather than a subordinate receiving instructions. As she returned to her tasks, Angela's thoughts drifted to Mr. Wilson. He had been discharged from the hospital a few days ago, but his impact lingered. His letter had not only sparked change in the way others treated her, but it had also given her the courage to voice her own ideas more confidently. It was as if his words had become a catalyst, transforming what had once felt like a lonely struggle into a collective movement for respect and collaboration. Later that day, Angela was sitting in the staff lounge during her break, scrolling through her phone, when she saw an email notification from the chief nursing officer. She opened it, expecting the usual updates and announcements, but what she found instead was a personal note addressed to her. "Angela, I wanted to personally reach out and let you know that the impact of Mr. Wilson's letter is still being felt throughout the hospital. It has inspired us to launch an initiative aimed at recognizing and supporting our nursing staff more effectively. I hope you'll consider joining the committee that will help guide this new program. Your insight would be invaluable, and I believe you could help us make a real difference. Let me know if you're interested." Angela read the email twice, feeling a mix of emotions wash over her. It was a sign that the change she had long hoped for was actually happening. The hospital was taking steps to ensure that the contributions of nurses weren't just acknowledged when a crisis arose, but were consistently recognized as essential to patient care. She replied to the email, expressing her gratitude for the opportunity and confirming her interest in joining the committee. It felt like a natural progression of what Mr. Wilson's letter had started, an opportunity to ensure that the voices of the nursing staff would be heard on a broader scale. As the days turned into weeks, Angela found herself more deeply involved in discussions about the hospital's new initiative. She attended meetings with administrators, doctors, and other nurses, all of whom were eager to create an environment where every staff member felt valued. The conversations weren't always easy. There were different perspectives to consider, and not everyone agreed on the best course of action. But Angela remained committed, knowing that meaningful change required patience and persistence. During one of these meetings, Dr. Lawrence spoke up in support of a suggestion Angela had made regarding training programs for new nurses. "Angela's proposal to pair experienced nurses with new hires for mentorship is an excellent idea," he said. "It's a way to ensure that our standards of care remain high while also fostering a more supportive work environment." Angela glanced at him, feeling a sense of quiet accomplishment. The fact that he was now advocating for her ideas was a testament to the progress they had made, not just in their working relationship, but in the overall culture of the hospital. When the meeting ended, Angela stayed behind to gather her notes. Dr. Lawrence approached her once more, and there was a look of genuine respect in his eyes. "You're making a real difference here," he said. "I'm glad to see how things are changing, and I'm grateful that you've been a part of that." "Thank you, Doctor," Angela replied, her voice steady with conviction. "I think we're all making a difference, together." As Angela walked out of the meeting room, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey hadn't been easy, and there was still much work to be done, but the path forward was clearer now. She knew that the changes at St. James would not only benefit her but the entire staff and future nurses who would come to work there. It was about more than just improving policies, it was about creating a culture where everyone could thrive. The transformation that had begun with one letter had rippled through the hospital, touching the hearts and minds of those who worked there. Angela was no longer just a nurse who had quietly endured the challenges of her profession. She had become a voice for change, a symbol of the strength that lies in resilience and the courage to speak up. The day of Mr. Wilson's discharge had arrived. Angela was on duty that morning, and as she entered his room for one last check, she found him dressed and ready to leave, sitting in a chair by the window. He looked well-rested and calm, the lines on his face softened by a faint smile. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," she greeted warmly. "Today's the big day. Are you all set to head home?" Mr. Wilson turned to her, his eyes twinkling with the familiar kindness she had come to appreciate. "I suppose I am," he replied. "It's time to get back to the real world, though I'll admit I'm going to miss having you around, Angela. You've been a real blessing during my stay." Angela felt a pang of emotion, but she kept her tone light. "We're going to miss you too, Mr. Wilson. But I'm glad you're well enough to go home. That's the most important thing." She began to go over his discharge instructions, making sure he understood the medications he needed to take and the follow-up appointments he had scheduled. As she spoke, Mr. Wilson listened attentively, nodding at appropriate intervals. There was something different in his demeanor that day, an air of contentment, as if he had made peace with more than just his health. When she finished, Mr. Wilson reached for a small envelope on the table beside him and handed it to Angela. "I have something for you," he said. "It's a copy of the letter I wrote, the one that seems to have stirred up some things around here. I thought you should have your own." Angela took the envelope, her fingers gently curling around it. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what to say. Your words meant so much, not just to me, but to everyone here. You've made a bigger impact than you realize." Mr. Wilson's expression grew thoughtful. "I didn't write it for recognition or to cause a fuss," he explained. "I wrote it because I wanted to make sure that you knew how much you mattered, how much all of you matter. People like me, we don't always have the words to say what we feel when we're in a vulnerable place. But I figured I should try." Angela felt a lump form in her throat as she held the envelope tightly. "You did more than try, Mr. Wilson. You helped us all see things in a different light." A nurse arrived with a wheelchair to take Mr. Wilson down to the main entrance. As he eased himself into the chair, Angela bent down to meet his gaze. "You take care of yourself, okay?" she said. "And don't be a stranger. Come back and visit us when you're up for it." "I will," he promised. "And you keep doing what you do best, Angela. The world needs more nurses like you." As Mr. Wilson was wheeled away, Angela felt a quiet sense of closure. She tucked the envelope into the pocket of her scrubs, knowing she would read the letter again later, perhaps in a moment when she needed a reminder of why she did what she did. But for now, she had work to do, and there were other patients who needed her. The elevator doors closed behind Mr. Wilson, and Angela watched as he disappeared from view. A part of her felt a pang of sadness at seeing him go, but there was also a sense of fulfillment in knowing that she had made a difference in his life. His departure marked the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of a new one, both for her and for St. James Hospital. Angela returned to her duties, but she carried with her a deeper understanding of the power of small acts of kindness and the impact of one person's voice. Mr. Wilson's letter had not only lifted her up in a time of doubt, but it had also sparked a series of changes that would continue to ripple through the hospital. As she walked through the familiar corridors, she noticed subtle signs of progress everywhere. Nurses seemed more engaged, more willing to speak up during meetings, and even the doctors, including Dr. Lawrence, made a conscious effort to foster a more collaborative environment. There was still work to be done, but Angela felt hopeful in a way she hadn't in a long time. That evening, after her shift had ended and the hustle and bustle of the day had quieted down, Angela sat in the break room and finally opened the envelope Mr. Wilson had given her. She read the letter again, taking in each word with the same appreciation as the first time. It was a reminder of the profound effect one person's kindness could have, a testament to the resilience required to make a difference in the lives of others. Angela folded the letter and placed it in her bag, feeling a quiet resolve settle within her. She would carry Mr. Wilson's words with her, not just as a memory, but as a source of strength. And as she left the hospital that night, she knew she would continue to live up to the promise she had made to herself, to keep doing what she did best, not just for her patients, but for the legacy of compassion that Mr. Wilson had helped inspire. The weeks that followed Mr. Wilson's discharge were marked by a transformation at St. James Hospital. The letter he had written continued to resonate with the staff, serving as a constant reminder of the impact they could have, not just on the patients but on each other. It wasn't just the nurses who had taken his words to heart, the doctors, administrators, and even support staff seemed more attuned to fostering a respectful and collaborative atmosphere. Angela, in particular, noticed the changes in Dr. Lawrence. Although he maintained his high standards and expectations, his interactions with the staff had softened. There was more patience in the way he communicated, and when he offered feedback, it was often paired with encouragement. He began to ask for input from the nurses, valuing their perspectives as part of the decision-making process, especially when it came to patient care. One day, during a particularly busy shift, Angela found herself in the middle of a complicated case involving a patient with multiple health issues. As she worked to stabilize the patient's condition, Dr. Lawrence joined her in the room, immediately assessing the situation. "Angela," he said, his tone calm but decisive, "what do you think is the best course of action here?" She glanced at him, slightly taken aback. He wasn't just telling her what to do, he was asking for her opinion. "I think we should adjust the medication dosage and monitor the vitals every 15 minutes, she replied. "It might help to prevent a sudden drop in blood pressure." Dr. Lawrence nodded. "Good call. Let's proceed with that." They worked together seamlessly, each trusting the other's expertise. The patient's condition gradually stabilized, and as Angela stepped back to catch her breath, she felt a sense of mutual respect in the air. This wasn't just about following orders, it was about working together as a team. Later that day, Dr. Lawrence caught up with Angela in the hallway. "You did great work in there," he said, his expression sincere. "Thank you for your quick thinking." Angela met his gaze, her eyes reflecting a quiet confidence. "Thank you, Doctor," she replied. "I appreciate you asking for my input." The exchange was brief, but it carried the weight of all the small steps that had led to this point. The journey hadn't been straightforward, there had been moments of doubt, frustration, and the feeling that change would never come. But standing there in that hallway, Angela knew that the shift was real. It wasn't just about one person's transformation, it was about the entire hospital culture evolving towards something better. Angela's involvement in the committee to support the nursing staff was also beginning to show results. The administration had approved new initiatives aimed at improving mentorship for new nurses, providing more comprehensive training programs, and implementing regular recognition events for staff who went above and beyond. Angela found herself deeply invested in these changes, knowing firsthand how vital it was for the nursing staff to feel appreciated and supported. She often thought back to Mr. Wilson's words, "You helped us all see things in a different light." Those words continued to inspire her as she participated in the discussions and meetings, pushing for policies that would ensure that the contributions of nurses were recognized not only in times of crisis but as an ongoing part of the hospital's culture. The shift wasn't just noticeable during meetings or in interactions with the doctors. There was a new camaraderie among the nurses, a sense that they were not merely carrying out tasks but contributing to something larger. Angela could see it in the way they covered for each other during busy shifts, in the small gestures of kindness that had become more frequent, and in the sense of pride that came with knowing they were part of a team where their efforts truly mattered. The changes at St. James were still in their early stages, and Angela knew there would be challenges ahead. But there was a growing sense of optimism that permeated the halls, an understanding that progress was being made, no matter how incremental. For Angela, it was a reminder that even in an environment as demanding as a hospital, meaningful change was possible. As she walked through the hospital corridors that had become so familiar, Angela couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of fulfillment. The dynamics at St. James were indeed different now, not because everything had magically improved, but because people were more willing to acknowledge what needed to be done, and to actually do it. She paused for a moment outside Mr. Wilson's old room, now occupied by a new patient. The room looked the same, but the energy was different. It wasn't just a space where someone had been treated, it was a place where a profound change had begun. Angela knew that the hospital still had a long way to go, but she also knew that they were on the right path. It was a path of respect, collaboration, and genuine care, values that she had always strived to embody. As she turned to continue her rounds, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Mr. Wilson and his letter, but for all the small steps that had led to this point. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Angela felt truly hopeful about the road ahead. It wasn't just a matter of policy changes or formal meetings, there was a new spirit of understanding and mutual respect. As Angela made her rounds, she felt the difference in the way people interacted, in the way doctors consulted with nurses, and even in the patients' responses to the care they received. There was a shared sense of purpose that went beyond simply getting through the day. Angela's involvement with the new nursing committee had been an unexpected but deeply fulfilling turn in her career. It allowed her to channel the lessons learned from Mr. Wilson's letter into something concrete, something that could continue to evolve long after his stay at the hospital had ended. She knew that the work they were doing on the committee was still in its early stages, but there was a sense of momentum building, one that gave her hope for the future. One afternoon, Angela found herself in the break room, taking a rare moment to sit quietly with a cup of coffee. Her mind drifted back to Mr. Wilson, and she wondered how he was doing. She hadn't heard from him since his discharge, but she often thought about him and the impact his words had made, not just on her, but on the entire hospital. As if on cue, Angela's phone buzzed with a notification. She reached for it and saw an email from an unfamiliar sender. Curious, she opened the message and quickly recognized the name at the bottom, Mr. Wilson's daughter. The email was brief but heartfelt. "Dear Angela, I hope this message finds you well. I just wanted to let you know that my father often talks about the care he received at St. James and the difference you made during his stay. He still keeps a copy of the letter he wrote, and whenever he shares the story, he speaks of you with the highest regard. I wanted to thank you on behalf of our family for the kindness and compassion you showed him. It truly made a difference in his recovery and his outlook on life." Angela felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest as she read the message. She hadn't expected to hear from Mr. Wilson or his family, but knowing that his experience at the hospital had stayed with him, even after all this time, filled her with a profound sense of fulfillment. It was a reminder that the small acts of kindness she carried out each day could have a lasting impact far beyond the moment. She replied to the email, expressing her gratitude for the kind words and wishing Mr. Wilson continued health and happiness. As she hit send, she couldn't help but smile. It was as if the universe had chosen this moment to remind her of the importance of her work, of the value in caring, even when it seemed like no one noticed. That evening, after her shift ended, Angela returned to the staff lounge where Mr. Wilson's letter still hung on the bulletin board. She took a moment to read it again, as she had done many times before. The words were as powerful as ever, not just because of what they said, but because of the change they had inspired. Angela stepped back and looked around the room, reflecting on everything that had transpired since that letter had first arrived. There had been challenges, doubts, and moments when the path forward seemed uncertain. But there had also been growth, transformation, and a renewed sense of community. The journey wasn't over, and it never would be in a place where lives were constantly being changed and saved. But that was okay. It was the nature of the work, and it was what made every small victory matter. As she left the lounge and walked through the now quiet corridors, Angela felt a deep sense of peace. She had learned to embrace the power of her voice, the strength of her compassion, and the value of standing up for what was right. In doing so, she had not only found her place within the hospital, but she had also helped to shape it into a better place for others. The legacy of Mr. Wilson's letter would continue to ripple through St. James Hospital, a reminder that every person has the power to make a difference, whether by writing a letter, caring for a patient, or simply choosing to be kind. It was a message of hope that Angela would carry with her, not just as a nurse, but as a person committed to making the world a little better, one small act at a time. With a quiet resolve, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning."